Hey everyone, welcome back to the FPL Script Season 2, Episode 6. I'm your co-host Fran, otherwise known as FPL Fran on Twitter, with my co-host here, JD, otherwise known as Schadenfreudist on Twitter. Of course, this is the Game Week 5 preview, but before we head into that, just a Game Week 4 sort of review after a long international break as well, which is still ongoing. Of course, we have no major injuries so far, but hopefully that stays the same. In terms of my Game Week 4 recap, though, I had a very, very good, fortunate week once again. It really just came down to my one free transfer. I had the chance to go from Shaw to Diaz or from João Pedro to Alvarez. And ultimately, with the sort of leak that Luke provided alongside FPL Main Road, who is sort of Raptors' historic source on Man City leaks and early team news, we got a little bit of insight that Alvarez might start. And that likelihood pushed me towards an Alvarez transfer, and really the rest was history because I got super lucky, and ultimately it was a week where a lot of people didn't get many points outside of Haaland, who we all own.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference was getting a differential score from one of your players because apart from Mbuemo, I think, and his ownership has increased since game week 1, so he's not even that much of a differential anymore. I think he was more of a differential when he got his brace earlier on. So it was a terrible week for me. As you can see, I got a big fat red arrow. I'm almost at the brink of 1 million, but just waiting for season review to tell me once again how unlucky I am. It could have been better, and hopefully, with two free transfers, things will get better from here on. But for now, it's quite looking quite dire if I'm being honest. So if we move on to the topics for this week, I think the first thing obviously is double game week 7, which was announced. Luton and Burnley are going to play their game, which was postponed from game week 2, I believe. So what are your initial thoughts beyond the usual picks like the goalkeepers? What are you thinking? Are you thinking of getting these players in?
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, I've got no interest in these players whatsoever. In fact, I ran a couple solves, and of course, different points in time, but sometimes it's just been up to 0.2, 0.3 in certain weeks compared to just rolling in game week 7. So I've got no transfer plans whatsoever to go towards these players. I also didn't start with any of these players, so I suppose I'm in a little bit of a different territory than most. I have seen some managers, of course, look at the idea of bench boosting on 7, which I think is a bit wild. I've got to be honest. As you said, though, there are still going to be some options. It's a double game week. Inevitably, the EV is there for some players, but I think there's such a limited pool of players, and I'm not even sure, for example, genuinely this time, that I would go against Haaland just to push towards Morris, who already doesn't really seem like a fantastic transfer for myself.
And the key thing here is that, for example, you have someone like Trafford who has a slightly higher EV than, let's say, Kaminski. But if you look at the fixtures, I think I would rather go for Kaminski because like the EV difference is zero point 0.2, and Kaminski gets to play Everton and Burnley. So it's a much better bet, I think. If you give me the option, I would actually go for none of them. If you were to ask me to pick one of them, I would definitely go for Kaminski. And I think we spoke about this earlier before we recorded. And Giles seems to be the only possible option from Luton, just because even Kabore has lost his place, and even though his replacement got injured in the last game, I don't know if he's going to start. And for someone like me who already owns Kabore, it's okay. I'm going to play him because even if he starts one and is benched in one, it's quite okay. EV wise, it's still pretty good. But for someone to buy Kabore, I would just discourage them to do that. And as you said, at the striker position, I think Morris is the only probably decent option. So when I run a solve without thinking of a wild card, a review tells me to transfer in Morris for Watkins. Just because the run in for them is quite decent. I think it's Wolves, Fulham, and then the double game week, right? So it's not bad for Luton if you look at those four fixtures. Now, obviously, if there were no double game week and you had looked at those fixtures, I don't think you would have transferred him in. So again, you have to go back to what was your thought process before the double game week was announced and after, and what is the EV difference, and do you think that you punting on someone like Morris is going to pay dividends? Because of course, once you bring him in, the temptation to captain him is going to be strong, and rightly so because he's slightly ahead on Holland of Holland on EV. So it's a very tricky decision to make, and I don't envy anyone who has to decide between something like maybe wildcarding or not just based on this double game week, because I don't think it should be such a central topic or central theme of your FPL season.
100%. I think, I mean, a lot of people have been talking about, let's say, eight. 9, 10 wildcards.
Yeah.
And a lot of that discussion has been spurred because of the double game week 7. And if the EV gains are so small, I mean, I just can't see myself being prompted by this double game week. And ultimately, it's very hard right now to actually calculate, which is sort of the next topic that we have, a wild
Yeah.
card and when the best wild card would be for, our very own team dependent team. So one interesting discussion that I actually saw on the Twitter timeline was, I think, where Luke sort of started a discussion of how he thinks Wildcard 10 is a good week for him, which sort of led to review suggesting how we should probably look towards running solves for wildcards on different game weeks, just to see, for example, the sort of EV gain that we would get without decay. And yeah, he suggested effectively running solves with 1.01 decay. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so just to give a bit of background about this, so review currently does not have non-decayed mins input, which is why if you let's say activate a wildcard in FPL review solver at let's say game weeks 8, 9, or 10, it's not going to give you the similar result to compare. So you cannot really compare because the minutes are decayed further or the EV is decayed further as you go further down the line. So right now, the workaround that review has given us is essentially that you set the solver setting of decay to 1.01, which essentially inverts the decay. So you can get around that for now, and I think he's working on getting the fix in as soon as he can. That's one thing that you need to be cognizant of before you start comparing wildcards in 8, 9, or 10, because I suspect that without this trick, 8 is going to be the natural winner because it's earlier, and then you get a huge EV boost in an earlier week, which means that you get a lot more EV than you do further down the line. So just be careful of when you run solves and compare these wildcard runs, because a lot of that was happening before review stepped in and told us this workaround. So just be cognizant of that fact.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's an interesting point because, I mean, if you were to, let's say, wildcard this week, the hot topic and really the hot transfers would be to move into, having a bench of, let's say, Newcastle players, but actually, really, it's Son captaincy and even going for Maddison as
Yeah.
well, who I've seen, for example, on some optimal wildcard solves where I think the midfield that you'd probably most often be suggested if Salah's not included is to have, let's say, Son, Maddison, Saka, Fernandes, and Bumo. So that sort
Yeah.
of great lineup of penalty takers, probably getting the full weightage of both the Spurs penalty takers as well. And I mean, ultimately, this week is all about that Sheffield United game for these Spurs players, where for a lot of us who started with, let's say, United or 2x United midfielders and 2x Arsenal midfielders, it doesn't seem to make too much logical sense from a 6 to 8 game week EV point of view. But really, there is a lot of immediate EV to be gained by looking at, let's say, a Sun transfer or even a Maddison transfer that I think a lot of people, maybe outside of analytics, would be looking at. What do you sort of feel about that?
No, absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head with the double Spurs midfield, which I think is essential if you were to punt on the Sheffield United game as a whole. But again, you have to think holistically and see if that EV gain, that immediate EV gain, and then the subsequent EV loss, because remember that they are going to play Arsenal and Liverpool in the next 2 weeks. And you have both the midfielders. So if Spurs play badly, you suddenly lose out on two midfield slots. And there are other players like Rashford, Bruno, Saka who have better games. I mean, Saka plays Maddison and Son in one of those games, but as if you look at the 2 games stretch, they have better games. So you might lose out on more EV than you gain in that 1 week. And of course, you use a transfer as well. So that's even more EV loss, technically speaking. So that's why I think running solves with your own solver settings is more important, because if you value short term gains more, you can set solver settings accordingly to tailor your transfers as such, which means that your transfer strategy might be wildly different from someone else's who uses maybe even default review strategy, which is I think quite a safe strategy when it comes to suggesting transfers based on EV gains.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. And I think, as you say, it comes down to your individual team situation as well. Because if you, let's say, have 2 free transfers this week, I do think actually moving towards Sun, if you have the chance to do so, makes sense. And it probably will appear amongst, top 2, top 3 lines. I was speaking to Marco on Twitter, and he was running some sensitivity analysis on his solves. And actually, going towards Sun actually makes a lot of sense for him. but it's not, for example, the number one line when he just runs a simple sort of heavy solve. And so that's something to think about. If you're actually in a position to be flexible, such as having two free transfers, and maybe you have a little bit of doubt on some of the transfers that reviews suggest, like let's say Trippier, who I think will be an interesting talking point when we talk about defenders just after. But if you're a bit cautious about that, yeah, there is some upside really to be gained from
Yeah.
Son, and maybe you can tap into that. But it really, I would only do it if I really had that sort of safety of two free transfers, and if I didn't have any issues with my team. Because frankly, I've been an early transfer terrorist myself, and as we move into defenders now, I mean, I moved into Udogi to capture a price rise first of all, and to move out of Shaw.
And also the Shaw price drop. You missed the Shaw price drop as well. So that's like a point 0.2 EV, TV game.
Exactly, and actually,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
Udogi with good xMins, like let's say 82, 83, he's pretty close to Trippier's immediate EV versus Brentford. And there's still, for example, this sort of discussion to be had about rotation. I do think the interesting thing about Trippier is he played 3,300 minutes last season. That's incredible. And I really think that his fitness is not something that we should sort of laugh at. And I do find it hard to believe that he wouldn't be starting all these consecutive games with maybe actually, for example, something like the EFL Cup game versus City, where maybe I'm not sure, maybe Newcastle could even sack it, but it's hard for me to see him actually being rotated as much as people were initially worried about. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, I'm in exactly the same camp as you, where I feel like, let's say you have consecutive midweek games, and then you also have, let's say, some Champions League knockout game after that. We are talking about way down the line here, by the way, because in the group stages, it's already kind of decided that you have a midweek game and then you have a game on the weekend. And the EFL game, I think, is an exception, as you said, that where they could just play a completely second string squad, and that is exactly where someone like Livramento could get a chance to play instead of Trippier. But as you said, I don't think there's going to be a chance of him missing out on games when there are, let's say, two games a week for the group stages, especially. Later down the line, if we have, let's say, multiple Premier League games followed by a Champions League game, then we can maybe think about, oh, is he going to miss one of the midweek games or something? Because those are equally important. But right now, given the tough fixtures that Newcastle had and subsequently the poor start that they've had to the season, it doesn't seem that it's on the cards for now. But I understand where people's apprehension comes from, because naturally he's growing older, and even last season we've seen that him getting subbed off, even though was a nice thing for owners, is not really a good thing in the grand scheme of things, because if he's getting subbed earlier, it means that his fitness is not up to the mark. So the easiest thing would be to just rest him for a couple of games. But that didn't really pan out, because I think that was during the first half of the season, but we didn't really see that during the second half of the season. So given his kind of consistency with minutes in, let's say, the last 19-20 games that Newcastle have played, I wouldn't worry too much. If review shows you a line where he is clear cut the optimal move, or the move with the most EV gain, I would just go for it, like it has for me, for example. So I might just go for Trippier this week, and have a double Newcastle defense from Gameweek 6 onwards.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. I'm actually I was initially suggested Trippier, but Udogi was very close. So as I said, I made
Yeah,
that move.
yeah,
Plus, you have to kind of factor in these sort of price rises and falls. I was very fortunate, of course, that Udogi actually got sick, so he didn't even meet that, for example, U21 call up for the Italian national
yeah,
team. So yeah, we'll see what happens there. I think actually on Trippier, the tough thing too is, let's say even if you're waiting for Game Week 6 to actually pick him up, the issue is that easy game on paper versus Sheffield United is something that you still have to sort of punt into, right? Because you're going to see that AC Milan game right beforehand, and the first instance where we might see, for example, Trippier get rotated on an easy game on paper is Game Week 6. So that is probably the biggest issue with moving into Trippier.
yeah, yeah.
I'll still probably move into that because I don't really have any planned transfers up until Game Week 8, where once again, if we go back to Son, for example, that's, for example, the second avenue where you'd be looking back into getting Maddison or Son, depending on how we feel about those two players by then. And then actually, of course, if you've got the chance to go for a Spurs defender, I suppose Porro is actually someone who we could talk about because his underlying stats are out of this world. But, you know, for people who are very concerned about xMins, I think that they've got the right to be concerned, because Emerson's actually a very capable replacement compared to, let's say, Davies is for Udogi. So that's the
Yeah,
tough
yeah.
situation there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The contest for the right back position is much more lively compared to the left back. For me, someone like me who prefers stable xMins, I would just avoid them. But if you catch, like for example, a Pedro Porro game against Sheffield United and he starts, he could absolutely haul because, as you said, his XGI is through the roof, and it's again like a matter of timing and a matter of luck, obviously, because you get to have him play against a weak squad like Sheffield's.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, I mean, the last player in terms of crazy XGI through the roof that I think I might mention is Matty Cash. We know Moreno is actually back, but I mean, Matty Cash is insane numbers. Like, he's actually rivaling some of the
Yeah.
best midfielders in terms of expected goal involvement, and it's a little ludicrous, to be honest. I don't know how you feel about him. There clearly seems to be obviously an issue where Aston Villa are also a very poor defense, and even though they're entering into a decent run of fixtures, maybe that he's still not the pick that you'd like to go for. I don't know how you feel about him in general.
Yeah, so if you saw the game against Liverpool, the key part of Cash playing at right wing was the fact that they had a good enough centre back partnership going on, which meant that he didn't need to play there because Konza was playing as a fullback and they had Diego Carlos and Pau Torres as centre backs. But now the problem is, I think Diego Carlos got injured, which is why this in the second half, Matty Cash went back to right back and Konza came into the centre back position. So if that is the case, and if Diego Carlos is not fit for let's say the next few games, then I think he loses his appeal very quickly because he's going to play the traditional right back role once again. And if that's the case, then I would just wait till they have enough centre backs again because I think Tyrone Mings is gone for a long time if I'm not wrong. His injury was quite bad. So unless Diego Carlos comes back soon, I would just wait and watch because I think his impact or the impact of him having such a tremendous XGI is a result of the right wing position instead of right back. So if we can get to see him play at right wing again, I think he would be an immediate focus for me for whichever game week comes next.
Yeah, makes sense. I think it was just interesting to touch on him because he's a little bit of an anomaly now and obviously
Oh
very
yeah,
positionally dependent. But in terms of forward transfers, just to sort of round things off this week, I think it's a position where actually we're becoming incredibly bored with players unless they have some sort of
yeah.
miraculous super haul. But you're looking at a horizon where Isak becomes quite interesting. But actually, I think this season he's probably slightly worse of a pick going forwards, even though we might say that this Newcastle team is sort of continuously building on their strength as an attacking unit. The concern for me, I think, is his xMins is still really poor. And compared to last season, he's no longer getting those additional sort of left wing minutes because they now have really good depth between Barnes and Gordon. And that sort of makes me a bit concerned about overall his value. I get maybe 68, 70 minutes of Isak might be enough, but there just doesn't seem to be that sort of upside of even getting more minutes than that. So you're sort of looking at just the 73 minutes, let's say maximally for someone like Isak compared to someone like Julian Alvarez, who even though on review he's got similar xMins, we're seeing 90 minutes per game for him. So I think he's an asset where not too interested in him, and as a result of that too, not too interested in many other forwards as a transfer option because you could argue that Alvarez is now heading into a period where he's heading into some rotational doubt.
Yeah, if you got Alvarez last week, I think that was a good time to cash into the good fixtures, and that time frame is kind of expiring now. As you move further forward in terms of the game weeks, you have less and lesser of a window to get in on the good fixtures for City, and on the fact that Alvarez is a sure starter because the more players come back from injury or the more players are fit and ready for tactical changes, you will inevitably see him being benched once in a while. But with on your Isaac point, I was actually set on bringing him in last week. As in last week, I was all set on bringing him in this week, and then I was convinced by a couple of people from analytics that if you look at like his historic minutes and going forward he's going to even play more games, so it's inevitable that he's going to not start for a game because my initial thought process was he's going to start every game, he's going to play what 70 minutes, he'll get sub maybe sooner, but he's going to start. But that's not necessarily true, is it? Because they have so many attacking options now. I would say that him being a rotation option is more likely than Trippier. That's all I'm going to say. So I would rather punt on someone like Trippier than on someone like Isaac right now. But having said that, I don't think I'm going to triple up on the Newcastle defense. I'm still going to keep my options open in case of any injuries, any unforeseen injuries, and that maybe helps us in maybe selecting a midfielder or an attacker of our choice. But until then, I think I'm happy with the two Newcastle defenders, because that's like the first big fixture turnaround in terms of teams that we want to target. The second being Liverpool, of course, and that is why a lot of people are talking about wildcards later down the line. Just that's simply to target the fixtures that Liverpool have.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, the weird thing I think is really just I don't know exactly what's going on with Wilson's fitness, because I remember seeing some news about how he wasn't even involved in some of the England training, and I can't really understand. But when he's fit, he is someone who can easily take away Isak's position, and we've seen that before. But he seems to
Yeah,
really be struggling with his fitness. So
yeah. Too busy slagging off his 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 colleagues, his professional colleagues, right?
yeah, I mean, okay, and the last topic really this week, as per usual, is going to be captaincy. It's an interesting week, of course. Haaland finally not the number one option, and actually, there are two options who are arguably clear of him. One option who's not so popular in many teams in terms of Son from an analytics perspective, and then Salah, where I think there have been a slightly divergent crowd who already own Salah and probably could be looking at him again this week. But as I said, some people to free transfers could very easily move into Son. And I think I can understand wanting to do that transfer as well, because if you're, let's say, well set up, you've got a good bench, you don't have too much of a depth issue from a defensive point of view for Gameweek 5. It's sort of all clear for Son captaincy. I would probably do it if I had the chance to jump into some with two free transfers. And if I own Salah, I'd probably captain him too. I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, with Salah, I don't think there's enough EV gap for me to go there. If I did own him, of course I don't. But with Son, I'm getting more and more convinced that if you were to transfer in Son, you would have to captain him. That is a big part of the EV gain, that you bring him in and you captain him, because for that you are sacrificing one free transfer, right? So that has some inherent EV loss built into it. So in order to compensate for that, you have to get in all the EV that you can, and the one way is to captain Son, who has a considerably higher EV than Holland. I think it's point 0.6 right now, and it is subject to change as we get closer to the deadline. But point 0.6 and subsequently 1.2 when you captain him is not that bad. It's something that could make a lot of difference between, let's say, elite 1000 and not elite 1000, if you know what I mean. So in that sense, yes, even though necessarily I don't think that you should keep that target in mind, but just a target of having a healthy EV. Even from that perspective, Son is a great pick this week. I am going to run solves once again closer to the deadline. Right now, Son is not really a suggested transfer for me, but if he is further down the line, I might bring him in. My only worry, as we've spoken earlier on the pod, is the two fixtures right after this one. And if Spurs have a tough time there, immediately you would panic, and that could force even more suboptimal moves down the line. So it's rather, I would rather have more free transfers in hand and react accordingly. But yeah, if you do own Son, now's the time to captain him.
Perfect. Well, I think this sort of rounds up this week's episode. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll catch you guys next week.
See you guys next week. And just before we sign off, one thing is we will be releasing a UCL fantasy pod next week, and also my EV model is coming out next week. So stay tuned on both of our timelines, and you'll get to see the updates. So have a good one. Bye.